Let's start with a pop quiz. I reassure you there are only two questions and there aren't any right or wrong answers. But I should warn you in advance, you may have the uncomfortable feeling of finding out something about yourself. Here's the first question. How much money would you need to receive a month from now to make up for giving up $15 right now? So think about your answer, mark it down, or remember it. Second question. How much money would you need to receive 10 years from now to make up for giving up $15 right now? Again, think about it, mark down your answer, or just remember it. Now, as I said, there are no right or wrong answers here. But let me tell you what results were found by Richard Thaler, a prominent economist at the University of Chicago, when he did a survey like this some years back. When asked how much money would you need to receive in a month to make up for giving up $15 right now, the median answer in his survey, that is the answer where half the answers were higher and half the answers were lower, was about $20. When asked how much money would you need to receive in 10 years to make up for giving up $15 right now, the median answer in his survey, again, half the answers higher, half the answers were lower, was about $100. Now, you can compare that to your own answers, but I want to think a little more deeply about what these answers actually mean. If you give up $15 now and get repaid $20 at the end of the month, this is a total return of 33% in 1 month. For an annual rate, for present purposes, you can more or less multiply that by 12. And so really what you're asking for is an annualized rate of return of 400% in a year. On the other side, if you give up $15 now and get repaid $100 at the end of 10 years, the total return over 10 years is 560%. You need to work this out, but 560% over 10 years implies an annual rate of return of about 19% per year. Now, to economists, this is a real puzzle. Why would someone ask for a 400% interest for a short-term loan, but 19% annual interest for a long-term loan? Interest rates in the real world might be a little higher or a little lower in the short run than in the long run, but they're not this far different. What are these survey results telling us about people and about their attitudes toward the short run and the long run? A person who gives these sorts of answers is in effect saying, in the short run of a month, if I'm going to give up something, I need a really high return, or I'm reluctant to do so. In the long run of several years, if I'm going to give up something, I don't need as much of a return. In other words, I'm much more unwilling to give up something in the short run than I am in the long run. What would be the actions in the rest of their life with someone who had these kinds of preferences? Well, it's actually the kinds of actions that most of us recognize in ourselves, at least to some extent. We're talking here about people who would be happy to save money in the long term if they got a certain rate of return, but they don't ever actually start saving in the short term because they need a really, really high rate of return in the short term before getting started. Or outside of financial contexts, these are people who want to make a sacrifice of, say, getting more exercise in the long term, but they never get around to actually starting doing any exercise in the short term. Economists and other social scientists refer to these as myopic preferences. Now, of course, myopia is usually the word for physical nearsightedness, which causes people to wear corrective lenses. You can only see clearly what's very close. By analogy, myopic preferences are when you tend to just see the present or the very near future, and you can't as clearly see the long term where you're eventually going to be headed. Myopic preferences actually lead to people whose preferences change as an event draws closer in time. To understand how this happens, let me describe another survey, another economic survey of people's preferences. In that survey, they sometimes ask a question that goes like this. You have a choice. A year from now, you can get $100, or a year and 1 day from now, you can get $110. Which do you choose? Well, when you ask people this survey, pretty much everybody says, oh heck, I'll wait the extra day, I'll get the extra $10. Now consider another choice. Today you get $100, or tomorrow you get $110. Now, some people will wait the extra day, but an awful lot of people will say, oh heck, I'll just take the $100 right now. It's not worth waiting one more day for $10. Now, you can tinker with these numbers, of course, maybe find a version of that question that works for you. But my broader point is that waiting a day for 10% more is a really, really good return in the real world. Everyone should do that all the time, and it shouldn't matter whether the choice is set a year in the future or in the present. Even if the choice was $100 versus $101 a day from now, getting a return of 1% for waiting a single day is a really, really good return for waiting. It's like getting 365% over a year. But it's easy to turn that down when the time actually comes. When you say, oh, it's off a year in the future, I'll take the extra money. Who cares about waiting an extra day? I'm happy to wait that extra day a year from now. That's a different feeling from saying when it's in the present. A lot of people will say, now, I really don't care about that extra day, and I really want the money right now. So all of this is a way of saying that myopic preferences are a way of saying, I'll start tomorrow. And you really mean that, of course. The problem is, tomorrow never comes. Every day, tomorrow is still one day further away. Myopic preferences manifest themselves in many ways that have substantial consequences for society. Maybe the most obvious example of making a short-term sacrifice is saving money. Government economists have data on the personal saving rate. That is basically what share of your income gets saved. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, the personal saving rate was often around 10%. In the 1980s and the 1990s, the personal saving rate started dropping off, and there were actually a few quarters in the mid-2000s when the personal saving rate was near zero. In the aftermath of the Great Recession, the personal savings rate has bumped back into low single digits. Now, low saving clearly causes problems for households. If you hit a big expense, like you need to get your car fixed or buy a new car, or you have a period of illness or unemployment, it's difficult to deal with it if you don't have a cushion of savings to deal with. When you approach retirement, if you haven't been saving, you won't have the standard of living you would have preferred to have. For a country, their high rates of saving really matter too. High savings rates are part of what drives rapid economic growth because saving provides the capital for investment. High saving is what drove economic growth in Japan in the 1960s and 1970s. It's what helped drive economic growth in Korea and other East Asian nations in the 1970s and 1980s, and it's been a big factor in driving growth in China in recent decades. Conversely, a low U.S. savings rate means the U.S. economy becomes dependent on large inflows of financial capital from the higher saving countries around the world. These inflows, where other countries save money and send it to the United States, have been going on for a few decades now, and they may go on a while longer. But by their nature, they can't be permanent. Other countries aren't going to keep sending us their savings forever. Borrowing is the flip side of saving. In a number of cases, borrowing makes economic sense. If you're buying a long-lived asset like a house or a piece of business equipment, it makes economic sense to pay for it over time. Or if you're paying for something that'll have a long-term return to you, like a college education, it can certainly make sense to borrow money. But it's of course possible to go overboard, borrow far too much or in misguided ways. In the U.S. economy, there's an awful lot of credit card borrowing at very, very high rates. In recent years, there's about $800 billion or so outstanding on credit cards at any given time. There are a lot of people out there who have a real problem. They can't pay off their credit card debt, and they just keep paying interest and paying interest and paying interest, not for something that's going to give them a long-term return, but often for consumption that's already a long time in the past. So-called payday loans or check cashing loans are another issue. They work this way. You write a check for, say, $300. The payday loan store gives you, say, $280, but they promise not to cash your check for, say, a couple of weeks until the next payday. What's really happening here, if you think about it, is you're paying $20 for being loaned $280 over a period of 2 weeks. Now, that's a really high rate of interest, hundreds of percent, if you project it out over a year. However, about $40 billion in such loans happen every year. Myopia has to be part of the answer. People really want the money now. Myopia helped contribute to the housing bubble, too. In the housing price bubble of the mid-2000s, one of the central mortgage products was the so-called 228 mortgage. A 228 mortgage is a 30-year mortgage which had low payments for the first 2 years and then followed that with much higher payments for the following 28 years. The long-term plan, when there was a long-term plan, there wasn't always, was that borrowers could refinance after the first 2 years and get a new 228 mortgage, and so on, and so on, and so on, always making the lower payments and never needing to actually face the higher payments. People took out these loans in part because the first 2 years of payments were so low. And of course, the fact so many people took out these kinds of loans helped keep house prices inflating and rising higher and higher. But many people who took out these loans had no real hope of paying the premiums after the first couple of years. And then when housing prices turned down, refinancing those 228 mortgages became simply impossible. Thus, this myopia that led to the 228 mortgage helped provide the extra lending which helped drive up housing prices and inflate the housing bubble. It helped to make the housing market unstable, and it helped create a situation where many mortgages were ready to collapse. There are also lots of examples of myopic behavior that don't involve personal finance. For example, one of the potential answers to America's rising healthcare costs lays in these very issues of myopia. A large number of Americans have chronic health conditions. And when I say chronic health conditions, I mean here things like high blood pressure, diabetes, asthma, certain kinds of difficult allergies, certain types of cancer even, arthritis, acid reflux, even certain mental health issues. Now, by some measures, half of adults have at least one chronic condition, some more serious than others, of course. The key point here is that lots of chronic conditions share the following property. They have a situation where they can be managed pretty well and pretty cheaply day to day if you do certain things, take certain medications. But if those chronic conditions are not managed, it becomes much more likely that you're going to end up with a very costly episode requiring hospitalization. For example, the Centers for Disease Control reports that diabetes continues to be the leading cause of kidney failure, of non-traumatic lower extremity amputations, and of blindness among adults aged 20 to 74. If you manage your diabetes, those conditions aren't as likely to happen. Similar grim outcomes are possible if, say, you don't continually manage your high blood pressure. That can lead to stroke or heart attack. If you could get people to manage these conditions better, which again involves both medical treatments like taking certain medications regularly, being screened regularly, having some lifestyle changes, we could probably save hundreds of billions of dollars a year in healthcare costs. And the savings would be even more than that if you could count the costs of people just not being sick and increased worker productivity. How to do this is one of the hot topics in healthcare reform today. Presumably, the answer involves some mix of coordinating care across all the different healthcare providers, so you don't leave out the cheap care, the preventive care, the medication, the checkups, which can really help to manage these diseases. It might be in many cases that the most cost-effective health care isn't really health care at all. It's follow-up daily phone calls, it's emails and text messages about things like remembering to take your asthma medication. It's often hard for healthcare providers to bill for this kind of service, but it's really a big deal in dealing with chronic conditions. Another part of the answer probably requires much better computerized health records, shared across providers. And again, you want to have incentives for healthcare providers to provide this kind of care. In fact, one suggestion I've heard is we should actually pay some patients with chronic conditions to take their medication. Because if they don't take their medication, the costs of hospitalization that result can be so very, very, very high. How do we get over the myopia for patients? It's a difficult issue. Another issue rooted in myopia is energy conservation. The United States has an interest in finding ways to conserve energy use. After all, lower energy usage means less dependence on foreign sources of energy. It means less emissions of pollutants into the air. It means less need to build large new electricity plants or to exploit our own energy resources. Of course, this all needs to be done in a cost-effective manner, and some ways of conservation are better than others. But my basic point here is that conservation often requires an upfront decision to spend money, say on insulation or on an energy-efficient appliance, and the rewards come later. Often, that gets us into a situation where myopia rules, and the immediate investment doesn't happen. Consider a basic choice: buying a refrigerator that costs $50 less today, but is less energy efficient. So it'll cost $50 per year to run more every year into the future. Essentially, if you think about it, you invest $50 now, and you get a return of 100%. $50 every year for the life of the refrigerator, maybe the next 10, 15, 20 years. If you can invest to get a 100% rate of return, this really seems like a slam dunk. But without some special rebate, myopia rules, and many people just don't do it. I've heard similar claims from folks who do energy conservation retrofitting on big office buildings. I heard a talk not too long ago about how, with new windows and insulation and reconfiguring the heating and cooling systems and automatic timers, all those kinds of things, it's possible to create a situation where the cost of the energy conservation is repaid 100% in 2 years. Now, this is a darn good return on investment. But it turns out that many companies aren't happy with that, and they apparently have told them that they won't do this kind of thing unless they can get repaid 100% in less than 1 year. Presumably, the reason for this is so that there wouldn't be any effect at all or even some savings on their annual financial statement. Now, you could multiply these kinds of examples of where we seem too focused on the short run and unable to address the long run. In our public policy world, for example, this sort of issue arises in dealing with the problems of budget deficits or the long-term costs of Social Security and Medicare. It comes up in dealing with long-term environmental issues like climate change or the health of the oceans. One interesting example is high school dropouts who don't give enough consideration to the long-term consequences of dropping out. In a later lecture on obesity, there's an issue of short-term diet and exercise choices leading to undesired long-term results. You can probably give some examples of your own here. But rather than just multiplying the examples, I want to take a step back and take a broader view. Imagine that we know we're myopic. We know we're in danger of acting in ways in the short term that we won't like in the long term. If that's true, then self-interested and purposeful people who know they have myopic preferences will try to set up ways to overcome their myopia so they can get to a situation they prefer. With myopic preferences, people say they want to do something in the future, but when the time comes, they don't actually do it, and later on, they regret not having done it. Are there ways for people to get over this hurdle? Can you somehow act to lock yourself on the course that you say you prefer? There's several different ways you might tackle this. One basic approach here is rules of thumb. A rule of thumb might not always make perfect logical sense, but they can potentially serve as a useful counterbalance to being short-sighted. What do I mean by rules of thumb? I mean certain rules to live your life by, like have saving be the first thing in your budget, not the last. Save enough so you have 2 months' salary ready for emergencies. Don't borrow money except for big items like house, car, family, education. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. Eat your vegetables with dinner. Have dessert later. Turn off the lights before you leave a room. Now, clearly, many of us have trouble following various of these rules of thumb. They aren't quite powerful enough, but one way to understand their function in our lives is that they're a little mantra that helps us to overcome our myopia. What about responses from the market? If I know I'm prone to short-termism, is there some way I can sign up for something in the market which will help me? For example, I could set up a savings account so the money goes right to that account without ever passing through my checking account. Years ago, they used to have what were called Christmas club arrangements, where people would put aside a certain amount of money throughout the year so they could have a big goose and other blessings of the season at Christmas time. One economic study looked at signing up for a health club. At this club, there was a monthly contract of $80 a month, but you could pay per visit for $10 a visit. Now, if you think about the logic of that situation, it should be that you need to go at least 8 times a month to make it worth having a monthly contract. But in this study, the people who bought the monthly contract only went 4.4 times a month. Now, why would that be? Either these people were trying to force themselves to pre-commit. Maybe they thought they would go more often because they could tell themselves they already paid for the health club membership. Or when they get right up to going, then it seems less attractive. So they end up overstating how much they will actually go. There are lots of other examples. There are drugs, for example, that if you're an alcoholic, you can take that will make you nauseous if you consume alcohol. There are people who go to fancy spa resorts where you pay lots and lots of money and they guarantee to feed you only a very, very small amount. These are all different ways you can pay someone in the market to help you overcome your myopia. There's also a potential role here for public policy in response to myopic preferences. These kinds of public policies can be viewed as helping people act in the way they want to act in the long run, but they find themselves unable to act in the short run. For example, Social Security can be viewed as a way of guaranteeing that people who've worked all their lives have something to live on when they reach retirement. There are other proposals for saving that would go further. For example, you could require all firms to offer retirement accounts and push people to put some money in those accounts. Cigarette taxes can be viewed in part as a way of helping some people who want to quit in the future and who wish maybe they had quit in the past, but they just can't seem to quit in the present. You're trying to help those people get over the hump and get to the behavior that they actually would like to choose. Other examples. Some years back, they changed the law in West Virginia so that high school dropouts couldn't get a driver's license until they were 18 instead of when they were 16. When they changed that law, the high school dropout rate fell by 1/3. Now, it seems pretty unlikely. There were a lot of high school students who were carefully weighing and balancing the costs and benefits of completing high school over the long term. They were balanced right on the knife edge, and the driver's license thing just tipped them over into completing high school. Instead, what's more likely is that a lot of high school students are myopic and short-sighted. They're ignoring the long-term effect on their life of dropping out of high school. If they need to stay in high school to get a driver's license, they're still ignoring the long-term effects. But now, myopia is pushing them to get a better life choice. Taken together, these rules of thumb, these private sector actions, and the public sector actions surely have some effect in reducing the effects of myopic preferences, at least for some people in some situations. But myopic preferences remain an issue that manifests itself for many of us in different ways all through our lives. And moreover, the existence of myopia poses a deep challenge to the economic way of seeing the world. The fundamental idea of the social science of economics, as I've been emphasizing over and over throughout this course, is the notion that people look at the trade-offs that they face and they make a decision about what they prefer. But what if people don't make a single preferred choice? With myopic preferences, you begin to ask the question, who are you really inside your brain? Are you the person who sets the alarm to get up the night before? Or are you the person who turns off the alarm and keeps sleeping, and then later on regrets not having gotten up on time? Are you the person who signs up for the health club membership? Or are you the person who skips going after you signed up and then wishes you had gone more? Are you the person who would like to accumulate a nice nest egg before retirement? Or are you the person who doesn't save very much, but then continually regrets not saving very much throughout their adult lifetime? We all like to have a belief we are by and large people who make up our minds and make decisions. But what if our decisions change systematically in this myopic way? So we have a hard time acting in the present on what we say we prefer in advance, and later on we'll regret that we haven't done. Modern brain science often emphasizes that the brain has different parts that offer different reactions. For example, some parts react more to emotion, some parts of the brain react more to logic, some parts react more to words or numbers or smells or colors, and so on and so on. The point of modern brain science, in many cases, is that the brain is not one control center with one voice speaking. The brain is a bunch of different locations, and which part actually governs your behavior can vary depending on the context of a particular situation. Economists have tried to use this idea from brain science to model the seeming contradictions of myopic behavior as multiple personalities. One idea here is called mental accounting. The idea here is that people split up their financial options in their mind into different categories. One category, for example, is current income. You think of that as your paycheck or maybe gifts you get or money you win somehow. A second category is your assets, like your house and your financial investments. And then the other is your future income, which would be your pension plan or your Social Security. Now, a pure economic point of view views these categories as much the same. Say, for example, the value of your house went up 10% in a year, or maybe more realistically these last few years, say it fell 10% in a year. To most people, their assets changed, but their current income didn't move. To economists, however, your house value going up 10% in a year is the same as winning a lottery prize of that amount in this year. It's the same as getting a pay raise of equal amount this year. It's even the same as finding out that in 5 years, you're going to get a payment from the account of some relative that's equal to that amount, minus the interest over the intervening 5 years. So you can think of myopia in a way as a battle between these mental accounts. There are other ways of thinking about myopia as well. You can think of there as being two personalities inside us all, a planner and a doer. And in a conflict, the doer is present-oriented, wanting to do stuff now, and the planner is future-oriented. This mixture of personalities leads to certain kinds of contradictions that occur in many of us. You can imagine, for example, someone who's a heavy smoker and spends a lot of time worrying about their retirement savings. If you're a heavy smoker, maybe worrying about your retirement shouldn't be your biggest concern. You can imagine someone who is totally committed to their career for several decades, is an enormous workaholic, and then throws it all away by sexually harassing an intern or something like that. Some action which is incredibly myopic. You can imagine someone who tries to save by taking all their loose change and putting it in a jar, but who buys an air conditioner or refrigerator that isn't energy efficient, even though the extra cost of doing so would be covered in 6 months or a year. They save in a short-term way, but not in a long-term way. The idea of bringing insights from psychology and brain science into economics has become known as behavioral economics. It's a hot topic in economics over the last decade or two. Behavioral economics looks at what happens when individuals display actual human limitations and complications. Myopic preferences are one of the main examples. We'll talk about some other examples in some of the other lectures. The idea of myopic preferences is fundamentally different than the other ways markets can break down. When problems arise like pollution or poverty or trying to build infrastructure and public goods, these are all problems for economists of how people or firms follow certain incentives and end up in an undesirable situation. But in those cases, the people are all perceiving their private incentives clearly. It's just that when they follow their private incentives, they come out with a social outcome that isn't necessarily what's desired. Behavioral economics is what happens when you don't see the incentives clearly, or when it becomes hard even to say whether someone tried to make a sensible decision, because the desired decision itself is varying according to the time frame. Putting the behavioral into economics has been a hot topic at least since the 1990s, and it looks ready to generate much more research in the years ahead.